Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage David MacKinnon, Vice President, Chief Security Officer, N-able.
Is everybody full? Got some food, hopefully. So I'm Dave MacKinnon. For those of you who haven't met or heard me talk before, John will call me D-Mac. It's actually a nickname I've had forever. So since I was playing hockey in high school. So please call me D-Mac. I'll actually respond to that more than I'll respond to Dave or David, but you can take your pick. I've been with N-able for the last 18 months. Came on to build out the security program. And prior to that, I've spent like the last 20 years in security, so definitely have kind of a background there. And had the opportunity to come to N-able. I guess I started interviewing last March or April. And N-able was very unique to me in that, one, I didn't know much about the MSP space, but two, it was very kind of greenfield. We were building a new company. I had the opportunity to come in and kind of build things out. And ironically, one of the things we did when we spun out was we went cloud first, we went cloud native. We don't have much data center space at N-able. So as we started to build out this ecosystem, we were making that transition live and on the fly. So even right now, inside of N-able, outside of product hosting, for N-able itself, we have 1/2 of a rack of data center space total. That's all we use. Everything else is cloud first, cloud native. And it's been a really cool journey to go through and kind of build out a lot of the security controls that we had. So I'll talk a bit today about kind of things we look at. I've talked to my team, we've talked to some of our architects, things that we're doing, make some recommendations, ideas, and we'll go through a little bit of a journey. I'm going to start with really a statement which, as we've moved to cloud first, cloud native, it's forced the attackers to change how they're attacking us. And that's not new. I mean, attackers are going to continue to evolve their tactics to basically monetize whatever their action on objective is. And even the best teams are vulnerable, and it's not necessarily a product problem, it could be a configuration problem. And that challenge I really think is amplified. I mentioned it earlier when I was up here with John, which, we've had this castle approach for years. We built a castle, we drop all of our equipment in it, we put our users in it, we build out a DMZ, we let specific access in. Working from home wasn't a thing. And I remember, I guess it was probably 10, 12 years ago, I was interviewing for a job as a security architect. And they asked me the question of, what is your thought on the cloud? And I was like, it's a necessary evil. Like, I didn't trust it. Who knows how this is going to work, but businesses will start to adopt it. And, it took time for us to get comfortable with kind of making that plunge. Has anybody here ever skydived? A couple of people? All right. So I went for the first time with my dad a couple weeks ago. So my dad's 71. He bought it for me as a Christmas present, and I thought it was awesome. But when you're in the plane, we were at 14,000 feet. You're like, crouch down, cross your arms, and you're just going to get shoved out. And like that's your oh shit moment. Like, I'm about to trust this person throwing me out of a plane at 14,000 feet, falling at 150 miles an hour, and I hope that parachute deploys. It's awesome. I totally recommend anybody who is thinking about doing it, do it. I'm hooked now. I already booked to go again. But that's been a lot of that we need that initial push as we move forward into that cloud. And some of that push for us came as a result of COVID. COVID hit, and I'm sure everybody was in a similar position, but we were forced to move to a remote environment, heavily virtualized, fast as hell. Like in my world, so previously, I ran security operations, incident response, and a number of other programs for AT&T and Warner Media. So I had 80 to 100 analysts underneath me. We were responsible for 24/7 monitoring for 280,000 people. And I found out on Wednesday that our office, I worked at CNN Center in Atlanta, was going to be closing down on Friday, and I had to move everybody remote. And I think a lot of people went through this, like, how the hell are we going to do it? How do we move 24/7 operations? Is this going to work? What do we need to adjust? And we had all sorts of problems as a result of it. We had VPN DHCP pools that didn't have enough IPs. We didn't have enough bandwidth. We had licensing. Like, we had all sorts of issues. We planned for this, like we were ready, but But really, COVID has been the accelerator, and I think it's here to stay. Like that pivot to cloud, the pivot to SaaS first, that is where everybody's going. And if you look at where we're going, over the next, what I would say 3 to 5 years, and Mike talked about it earlier. I think Mike already left, but Mike had talked about it earlier. Like once we get into serverless operations and things like that, that adoption is going to be very, very rapid. And even Gartner has stats out talking about all new projects by 2025, I think 80 or 90% will be cloud first. And it really is it's a blessing and a nightmare all at the same time. So like when you look at cloud, when we all buy it, like, hey, we're going to move to cloud, we're going to do this cool thing, it's sold as an easy button. Like, yep, you click the button, the thing happens, and you magically get this infrastructure, and you're awesome. And that's true. Like you can call an API and do those things, or you can do it manually in the UI. But what you really get is something a little bit more like this. So a puzzle that would be harder, and this is a real puzzle. So if you ever really want to piss somebody off, like totally buy it for them. Because I think when I was doing the research, I saw it. I was like, hey, I don't know who's going to get this, but somebody is. But that's what you get as you move into the cloud. You get so many moving pieces, so much to configure. There's a real level of expertise that you have to work through that's difficult, and it's constantly changing. So as I went through this, kind of building out this deck a few weeks ago, I was curious because I didn't know the number. Like I had no idea what the number was for the number of services that Amazon or Azure have available. So, and what I found was Microsoft has 499 different services that you can configure in Azure today, and that was as of a couple weeks ago, so it might be higher. I didn't check it this morning. Amazon has 202 different services that you can configure. And then I was curious because I don't know if it was John or Mike, they were talking about how do you train people? Because that's a challenge I have. Who here has a full security team? Nobody raised their hands, or one hand. Filling your security team is damn near impossible because there's a labor shortage. There has been for security. It's a very secure career path to go into. I encourage everybody to do it if you love it. But part of that for us is how do we make sure that we're keeping people up? And what are the options as it comes to training for those folks? Microsoft has 12 total certifications. So 202 services, 12 certifications. It's kind of hard to be an expert at a cloud level when there's so much variety there. Microsoft had a bit more. They had 117 services around their cloud cert, and they had 300 certifications total. So Microsoft, they've dominated in that space for years and years. Going back, I'm going to date myself, but back to the MCSE days where back in the early 2000s where everybody was an MCSE, like that was the pre-CISSP standard that everybody had to go get. At least it was in my world. And they're constantly releasing new features. So how do you make sure that you're keeping up with, in Amazon's case, limited certification opportunities with rapidly evolving technologies? So one of the things I thought was really awesome, does anybody here have a satellite you use for your job? Damn. You can control a satellite with your AWS account. I had no idea that you could do this, but they have the infrastructure in place that you can sit down and can do all the ground control that you need to do for your satellite. That's the forward thinking that these vendors are going to. Like they see an addressable market for satellite control in Amazon, and they're going to continue to push that envelope. There's no chance of them. They're not going to be like, all right, well, we figured all this shit out. Like, let's just monetize this and move on. They're going to keep investing in new technologies where they think they can make money. I think serverless is a huge area where they want to focus on that. And we have to stay on top of it. As an MSP, candidly, I think you guys have the biggest challenge because you have a whole bunch of different customers. They all have different expectations. They all have desires for different configurations. I call certain people snowflakes in my world. Like, I'm sure everybody here has a snowflake or two that you have to deal with. You have to figure it out. How are you going to handle supporting that specific environment? And at the same time, how do you protect it? So when I look at just from an attacker perspective, threat actors really, they have two motivations, and you candidly can break this down to where in the world they're coming from. They want data, or they want money. It is really simple. It's the only two things they give a shit about. Like, they want to figure out how do they get the information out of your environment. And we have all these technologies. There's what, let's say 500 different services you can set up in Microsoft, another 200 in Amazon. So if you support just those two cloud platforms, you're dealing with 700 plus services. And those technologies aren't perfect. But what's worse is their configuration. If you configure it wrong, is even more of a risk. So, when I talk about the ease of AWS, it's really easy to spin up a Windows VM in AWS, or you can do it in Azure too. And anybody who has maybe a lazy developer is like, oh, I want to RDP to that from home. Let me pop open 3389 because then I can connect to it anywhere. And they do this. Like, I don't understand why. I mean, I understand why, but we make it really easy for them. And we have to put in controls that says, oh shit, there's 3389 open on the internet in one of our Azure accounts. How do we lock that down? And we give controls into those cloud environments to folks who don't have the expertise. They don't have a security hat. They have I need to do this thing. I need to do it fast. I need to make my life easy. And it's a real challenge for those folks. And if you look back going over the last, let's say, 10-ish years, the target has largely changed. So if you go back, when was Target? 2013, I think? Somewhere around there. If you look at the Target breach, they were looking at credit cards. Previously, I worked at ADP. So we did credit cards, we do payroll for like half the US, we move trillions of dollars every year. And in our case, part of our team was fraud. So we also handled fraudulent charges on credit cards, and we got a notification, I think it was in November of 2013, that some of our credit cards were for sale on an underground forum. I was like, okay, cool. They wanted this Bitcoin thing to go buy them. I was like, how does Bitcoin work? So thank God I got into it, because it's made me a few bucks. But I had to go to downtown Newark in New Jersey, and I exchanged a gift card for this digital currency that I was able to go off and buy credit cards. And I think we paid 15, maybe 20 bucks. Like, it was not a huge investment to buy these credit cards. And we bought a few of them. And once we went into the analysis of it, what we were able to find was those cards, we actually tied it back to Target. We didn't really know the details. I worked with some folks from Walmart, so I called my buddy at Walmart, and I was like, hey, there's this thing, we think it's Target, and he's like, they know, we're working with them on it, you're good. And then it was really weird because I had to tell my parents, I was like, hey, if you go to Target, use cash. Now, if you're from New Jersey, which I am, I mean, I live in Atlanta, but I'm from New Jersey, so the good part of New Jersey, not what you see on TV. It's the truth. Everybody's like, man, Jersey's a shithole. I'm like, well, that's because that's all they show you. Like, Newark is not great, but I grew up on the Appalachian Trail. Like, literally the top of my road was the Appalachian Trail, the bottom of my road was a lake, and I skated all winter, and that's how I started playing hockey when I was little. But we always carry cash. I still always carry cash. I have cash in my pocket. It's just, my dad beat it into me, and now I always carry cash. But I would call my mom. I was like, hey, if you're shopping at Target for any Christmas presents for the boys, maybe you just want to pay cash. She's like, well, why? And I was like, I can't really tell you anymore, but really you should pay cash. So, but that's how they cash these things out. They would, they'd sell the credit cards in the underground. They had a wealth of credit cards. I mean, they were pulling all the POS data for months and months. But that really is tapered off. I mean, you think about it, when was the last credit card breach you've heard about? I mean, you don't hear about it. Now that we moved to chip technology in the US, which is still weak compared to Europe, like chip and pin would be better, but that's a whole other debate. But today, they go for something a little bit more valuable. So you think credit cards, you're selling a credit card for, let's say 20 or 30 bucks. Today, it's actually much less. I'd say it's maybe 15, and you're buying in bulk. Like, I'm going to buy 1,000 cards. Here we go, depending upon what level of Stripe data you have. But ransomware, who here hears about ransomware like every freaking day? Like, everybody. It is something that they're talking about constantly. Does anybody know what the average payout for a ransom is? Guess? $280,000. That is the average payout for a ransom. And even the government in the US is putting in regulations around if you have a ransom payment of over $100,000, the Treasury will have to approve it. So that is part of some legislation that we're actually, Redlyn Murphy's on my team, she's hiding in the back of the room. She runs our GRC team. But we're going to talk about some of those regulations tomorrow, how they could impact MSPs and things like that. But it's easy money. You know, it doesn't take much work to break into an environment, deploy ransomware, and get a lot more cash than stealing credit cards. And there's really 3 primary ways that they'll get into an environment. Like it's not rocket science. First is misconfigured systems. You have 3389 open to the world. They can dance into it, and they get access. Second is vulnerabilities you have failed to patch. Exchange dropped a vulnerability Friday, then they updated it yesterday, and things like that. That is an easy pathway in. And the third is users. I mean, if they click an email, do something malicious. But even the ransomware actors have figured out, hey, like we want to get paid, so it's not just we're going to come in and encrypt your boxes. We're going to come in, we're going to steal all your data, we're going to hold your data for ransom. You have to buy it back, and we're going to go encrypt your boxes. And it's a very difficult environment to figure out how you're going to recover from it. And working with teams to do that it's a huge challenge. Like, how do you combat that? And as we've pivoted into cloud, and I know a lot of people here are already in the cloud, but the target for attackers right now is an identity. So when I think about what I want to go target, because we've moved SaaS first, cloud first, if you're using Azure AD or whatever federated identity provider you're using, all of that sits in the cloud. And guess what? Once I have access to that, I can get into a tremendous number of applications across the network without ever connecting to the VPN. Like I don't connect to the VPN at Enable, ever. Unless I need to connect to some core backend systems, like VPN for me is really, it's not a tool in my arsenal. And the attackers know it. Does anybody know, I'm sure there's been 3 big, I think, newsworthy issues in the last few weeks with Uber, Rockstar Games, and IHG. Does anybody know how they push through? Yeah, exactly. They pissed the user off. They hit him with a ton of freaking MFA challenges, and finally they were like, screw it, I'm tired of this stupid application, leave me alone. And they got in, and once they get in via that session, they move laterally. And that is a huge, huge risk from a business perspective and I look at it from an MSP perspective, how do we make sure that we're protecting all of our customers, which have all these different configurations, they're all moving into cloud, from those types of attacks. So I came up with a top 10 list, and not like the David Letterman top 10 where it's funny. I mean, some of it might be, but I came up with a top 10 list that I just wanted to talk about things, and this came from my team. Like, we talked to some of our architects, we've talked to our IT teams. Like, what did we go through as we went and became Enable, and how do we drive security and securing our cloud infrastructure? I will tell you, you don't have to take notes. We're going to put a blog post out about this later today, whenever Stephen drops it. But the goal was to really, I want people to think about, there are some easy things we can do that can help protect you and your customers. And then how do we take those things, and I know earlier we had the talks from Mike and team about automation. Like, how do you automate those in a consistently configurable way? So a lot of what we're doing right now is, I was told a long time ago by a guy named Dave Dowling, I worked with him at ISS. He was like, if you hate doing something in your job, automate it out of your world. And I've lived by that statement for the last probably 20 years. If I hate doing something, stop doing the thing. Like, build scripts. Like, I'll date myself, but I did it in Python, or I did it in Perl back in the day. I've learned Python, so I'm a little bit better now. I still hate PowerShell. I'm sorry. But you know, my goal has always been to automate those things out of your world. So as we look at what should you do from a cloud perspective, the de facto standard is MFA. Like, the fatigue attack, spot on, like that, it is a real risk. But you can configure MFA to block and prevent those types of attacks. So in our world, like in the Enable world, if you fail 5 push requests for MFA, I will lock your account out. Because I'm worried about somebody doing that exact attack against one of our users. We put this in months and months ago. Does anybody here use Windows Hello with passwordless auth? We got a couple. So if you're not familiar with passwordless auth, it is awesome. Like from a user experience, it is super simple. Our users hate me because I have password complexity requirements, which, well, that's my job. But so our goal was to really work with them to, one, reduce the amount of times they're putting in their passwords. Two, when they log in via MFA, they get a prompt with a 2-digit code, which they have to enter in the application to log into the system. If you don't have the 2-digit code, you can't go anywhere. So the phishing kits and everything else which don't account for that, you'll never get through. And three, we're actually changing our password shelf life. So I don't need people to change it every 90 days. I'm going to make it, I'm working with the CIO right now. We're leaning between 180 and a full year between password changes. And I had dinner with Mike Adler the other night, and he's like, I hate your new MFA. I was like, explain this to me. Why do you hate it? He said, well, I used to be able to do it from my watch, and I could just approve it, and now I have to get my glasses out, and I have to look at my phone, and I was like, okay, all right, I get it. Like, it's kind of a pain in the ass. But we talked through why we're doing it. And I said, okay, well, let's take any of the, and like, this is not to throw shade at Uber or any of the other companies, because when you have somebody who's targeting you, like, you always have the risk of them getting in. But I said, here's what I'm trying to prevent. I am trying to prevent those attackers from crushing you with MFA requests and you finally give in. So if you have the 2-digit, we kill that. And that, we've had really good adoption within the business. And I'm a Mac user, so I don't get the benefit that all you Windows guys get. Like, I actually have to type in my password every time, but like, I'm fine with it. Like, that's, being a Mac user, we're special snowflakes, and we deserve kind of some of the pain we get. So MFA for me is kind of the de facto standard. Anywhere and everywhere you can have it, you should configure it in a consistent manner. So how do you run audits to make sure that all of your user accounts have MFA turned on? How do you make sure you don't have basic auth turned on anywhere? So, and the third piece, which is really important, is never exposing single factor for like PowerShell. Like M365 is super powerful. They do everything in PowerShell. But once an attacker can get in with single factor and they do it via PowerShell, they move really fast. In the past, I ran an incident a long time ago when I was with a previous company, and they were targeting a journalist. So in my world, one of my responsibilities is I was responsible for security for CNN. And they were targeting a journalist. And what they were coming in trying to do specifically was they were trying to use PowerShell to get into M365. And they were creating a rule to forward all of the email from that specific journalist out to an external email address. Now, we had a policy in place that prevented forwarding emails, all emails, out of the organization. That's actually how we found that the account was compromised. But PowerShell itself was the foot in the door. So making sure that you're not allowing that single factor auth, that basic auth, is absolutely critical. The second piece, and this is more Microsoft-centric, but conditional access. I love conditional access. It is so powerful in everything that you can do, in that you can interrogate a device. You can make sure that it's your device. You can make sure that it's managed. You can make sure that it's patched. You can make sure that it has AV. You can interrogate all of the things that you want to know, and it gives you more of that zero trust access into the environment. So in my case, if I don't know your device, you don't get on my network. So, and that's from an application perspective or getting onto the VPN. We use conditional access in our world in both. So if you want to, we're a Palo shop, so if you want to connect to Global Protect, we're going to interrogate your box and make sure that it's somebody I trust. If you want to go into Salesforce, I'm going to put you through the same check. So not that engineers ever try and bypass security controls or disable security controls, but they always try to do that. We're using conditional access to really, I don't want to say force them, but to strongly encourage them to move down our path and follow our best practices across the board. And this is an area we're internally talking about with Cloud User Hub, which how do we come up with automations to really drive consistency in there from a building block perspective. The third one is really, it seems really simple, but we're always really guilty of it. I think all organizations have this problem, which is separating privileged accounts from standard user accounts. Nobody should be logging in with domain admin accounts. The other thing I would add to this is those really privileged accounts should all be vaulted. Like, you should not be using, storing it in a text file or in a Git repository or anything like vaulting those credentials, because those are the keys to the kingdom. And threat actors, that is what they're looking for. Like when they are working laterally in your network, make the assumption they're going to get in. Like we talked about it earlier, I always assume we're going to get somebody into our network. But having those overly sensitive credentials vaulted off is absolutely important. We're to the point now we're actually talking about, should we do YubiKeys for our admin users, like beyond everything else, because they physically have to have this before they can do it. It's an investment, and YubiKey, like you have the hardware support and everything else, but it's something we're looking at, like, because it does make sense for the level of access they have and what they can do. And we do additional monitoring for those users. And then what I add to that is, just because you're an admin doesn't mean you need to be an admin on everything. So in my world, like I have an admin account. I have a dedicated admin account. That admin account doesn't give me access to change anything in AD. I can't change specific things in M365, but I can change things in our security configuration settings where necessary. And I have to check it out and do all the things kind of normally, but having that RBAC configured on a per user basis, understanding the roles, and not over-privileging somebody is absolutely critical, because what you end up in is, if you're in a world where you have somebody with domain admin level credentials that can get to, like, again, think threat actor, like think bad guy. Assume bad guy's going to get in. That's all they need. Like once they have domain admin, they can pretty much do everything. The fifth, and I talked about it earlier, is understanding the technology you have and investing in training. I think training is probably the biggest one. If you want to keep people in your organization, we do it for security. John and I had a whole conversation last week around budget, but making sure that we're investing in our people to keep up to date on these technologies, both from a security perspective and from a technology perspective. We have, like on the architecture side, I have different engineers for AWS and Azure. We very intentionally know that we can't have kind of one size fits all for that cloud expertise, and we keep them up to date separately. But I think it's absolutely critical to understand what you're putting in your footprint. Like if you start moving to serverless workloads and things like that, make sure that you have a background in that. Understand how does it work, what does logging look like for it, and how do you make sure that you have visibility into that environment. And with that goes understanding your surface area. Like I was guilty of this when I moved into AWS. I did not necessarily have like a network castle mentality when it came to AWS. I'm like, all right, I'm going to spin this up. I'm going to drop an EC2 instance. I'm going to create a NAT interface, and I'm going to browse the internet and do whatever I need to do. But I never thought about separation of services, building DMZs, building secure architecture into these cloud workloads. And it absolutely is critical. Like just because you're using somebody else's infrastructure doesn't necessarily matter. You need to focus on making sure that you build those pieces out and make sure that they're secure. Monitoring for changes. So this is a big one. Understanding when things in your account changes significantly. And the example I'll give you is I had an incident years ago where IAM credentials were compromised. Now, the IAM credentials, and the attacker was stupid, but they came in and they spun up a ton of the most expensive AWS resources they could. And they used it for Bitcoin mining, which was stupid. Like, I'm like, you have access into a full AWS account with admin credentials, and you're spinning up coin miners. But understanding when you have that type of event, they put it in all of the regions we weren't using. So from a monitoring perspective, if your developers or whomever is in that environment, they don't have eyes on that environment, they're going to miss it. And paying attention to advisories. So who here gets the CISA advisories from US Cert? Handful? Everybody should sign up for those. They are some of the most useful pieces of information you're going to get. And it's not just US Cert. There's lots of different government organizations, both in the US and internationally, who put out those types of advisories. But CISA, I think back in March, did one specific to MSPs. Like MSPs are on their radar for being an attack surface, and they release information to help you be better. It's something they do every week. They send out a vulnerability breakdown of all the vulnerabilities that came out for the previous week, and then you'll get advisories throughout the week. So I don't know if there's been any today, but there was one for Drupal, and anything as it comes out. It's a really good source of information. It's very valuable as an organization to have that. The next one, and I talked about it earlier when I was up here with John, but planning. Like, I'm not going to beat it to death, but planning for when something happens. And what are you going to do? How do you investigate it? How do you not forget everything that you know? And the other half of that is planning for an employee departure. So we're in a situation now where you have users who have access to a large swath of your customers. They have very high privileges. Do you have an exit checklist? Sometimes you decide when somebody's leaving, sometimes they decide for you. We went through it, like, as we became Enable, I was like, all right, when we offboard somebody, what's under SaaS management so we can, just kill them in AD? What's standalone? How do we make sure that we protect those specific users? But having a plan for that, and ideally having an automation, like how do you have an automation in place so that those users, you can automatically just offboard them and kind of kill the accounts out? And when you do have an incident, and this is, to me, it's always very important, but what do you need to do to recover? So do you have a plan where you assume bad things happen? And what are you going to do to recover, and what order? Because one of the things I get, and I've been asked this question before, it's like, well, we're going to bring everything back online. But you don't have infinite resources to bring everything back online. And if you don't know what's most critical, so if you don't have a BCP and a DR plan, having those pieces laid out is absolutely critical to knowing how to get your business or your customer's business back online in an effective manner. Like when we help partners whose customers have been hit with cyber incidents, there's oftentimes that plan's not sorted out. So they start rebuilding stuff. They don't even know if the adversary is out of the environment. So having that plan, like going back and going through that tabletop, understanding what is that IR plan going to be, how are we going to do it, and then what is that, after you have containment and you're moving into recovery, how do you execute those steps is absolutely critical. And the last piece, and this is really, I think, a business differentiator. I think everybody should be using it. We use it extensively, but is leveraging CIS benchmarks. So CIS tells you what good looks like. There's level 1, there's level 2. You don't have to adopt all of their standards. Talk to your customers about how you're adding value. This is what good looks like. This is what we're building in your environment. This is how we're iterating. You may hear me say iterate to awesome. Like what you can't do is set a stair so high that nobody can reach it. But how do you build those stairs to build an organization up and show the value of the security investment that they're making through your business to make them more secure? We leverage this internally. And for anybody who's not familiar with CIS, they have benchmarks on everything. Cloud providers, servers, workstations, specific applications. Like, there is no shortage of ways to benchmark what you're doing. If you're an M365 shop, this reporting's built in, so you can actually you can run a score to see how you compare against that baseline and understand what gaps you have. Now, not every requirement in CIS may work for your business. They may say, hey, you should turn this off. You say, nope, we need that. I think that's defensible. But it's a really good benefit as you're trying to explain to your customer, well, I'm charging you more, but this is the value I'm adding. This is the risk mitigation, because oftentimes, everybody has it, it's this will never happen to me. Like from a security incident perspective, it's never going to happen to me, but then you turn on the news and it happens to everybody else, but it's never going to happen to me. It's kind of like, I have an alarm on my house. It's really just, if it goes off, did the boys open one of the back windows, or is somebody trying to break in? I don't know. But I assume that somebody's going to try and break into my house. Being able to tell your customers, hey, somebody might try something, but we have the detective controls in place. We have the recovery steps in place. We know what we want and need to do to protect you, is hugely beneficial. So I've talked a lot about the castle, but what about endpoints? So we've talked a lot about server infrastructure, how do we move all that, but our users now are all remote. Like, using the castle analogy, they've all moved out into the pastures or wherever they moved to. They're not coming back to the office. Like, I've threatened, I don't know if John's in here, I've threatened John. I was like, don't build an office in Atlanta because I won't come to it. Like, I don't want to go sit in traffic for 2 hours a day just to go to an office. But that's the new norm. Like, it will take years for us to get back to pre-COVID, in office, depending on the company. It's up for debate, but I don't see us getting back there. And from an endpoint perspective, there's a continued investment in endpoint devices. I don't think there's anybody here who doesn't say EDR is not valuable, EDR is not providing protections for my organization. But what we are hearing a lot of is EDR is hard to monitor, and we don't necessarily have the expertise in-house from a security perspective to know what to do when something happens. That's just a reality. Security expertise is expensive, and not everybody has that built in. So one of the things we're working through as Enable is building partnerships to help expand the ADR offerings for your customers. So we're right now working on expanding our partnership with SentinelOne for their Vigilant solution. We're also working with Blackpoint to expand out more of an MDR offering. And our goal is to be more a la carte. It's not going to be you have to pick from this vendor, and you pick what vendor works best for you and understand exactly what you want to do from a business perspective and what works best. And you're going to hear more about this in the coming months, but we did want to talk about it today. So if you're interested in getting that space, I know I get a lot of questions about, hey, when are you guys going to do this? We're going that path now, and it's in the near term. So if you want to continue to expand your service offerings, it's something we're going to have from an Enable perspective that we'll be able to help you out with. So with that, I actually didn't have anything else I wanted to cover. We're here, Redland and I are both here for the whole week. If you have questions, you want to know about what we do from a security perspective, what we do from an IR perspective, what we do from a compliance perspective, whatever the case may be. Redland and I are here. We're happy to answer your questions. I'm happy to speak nerd. I prefer to speak nerd more so than PowerPoint and Excel. Like my kids, funny story, but I was going to the airport a few months ago, and this for everybody who's been dealing with COVID, you'll get this, but I went out and I was wearing jeans and a polo, and my son looks at me and goes, "Dad, you're dressed fancy." And I'm like, man, I've been stuck in the house for way too long that the gym shorts with the polo on top is now jeans are considered fancy. But we're happy to sit here to answer your questions, to have those conversations. And I appreciate you guys all attending. I appreciate the time, and I hope you guys all have a great day. So thank you.